Yeah, I'm not a good cajoler, but I'm doing my best. I guess I'll just commence. All right, thanks everybody. I'm going to get started here so we can stay on time. I'm Rick Baldoz. I'm an associate professor at Brown University in the American Studies Department, and I'm going to be the moderator of our final panel today. It's a great panel, so you'll pat yourself on the back later for sticking around to the bitter end. I'm going to do some brief introductions of our speakers in order. And then I'll have them come up and do their talks, and then we'll have a short Q&A period at the end. I might take a chair's prerogative and ask a question myself to get the ball rolling, and then invite you all to join in the conversation. So our lineup today is first someone you're already very familiar with, Taína Caragol, who is the curator of painting, sculpture, and Latino art and history at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery, where we are at the moment. Caragol has spearheaded the inclusion of Latino historical figures and artists in the gallery during her time at the gallery, and her exhibits have been prominently displayed her passion and interest for Latino art and history. Caragol earned her PhD at CUNY Graduate Center in New York, and worked as a curator for the Museo de Arte de Ponce, Puerto Rico, before coming to the National Portrait Gallery. At the National Portrait Gallery, Caragol has curated exhibitions such as One Life, Dolores Huerta, The Face of Battle, Americans at War, 9/11 to Now, Unseen, Our Past in a New Light, Ken Gonzalez, Day and Titus Kafir, and 1898 U.S. Imperial Visions and Revisions, the wonderful exhibit upstairs. Our second speaker is Laura Katzman, professor of art history at James Madison University, a scholar of mid-20th century documentary photography on the U.S. continent and Puerto Rico. Her co-authored publications include Ben Shon's New York, The Photography of Modern Times, and Reviewing Documentary, The Photographic Life of Louise Roscam. She is a contributor to La Mirada en Construcción, Ensayo sobre Cultura Visual Puertorriqueña, and the editor of the Museum of the Old Colony, an art installation by Pablo Delano. Her book In Progress examines a post-World War II photography project of the early Munocista era in Puerto Rico. Katzman is currently guest curator of Ben Shon on Nonconformity for the Museo Nacional Centro de Arte Reina Sofía in Madrid, which is running from 2023 to 24. Our third speaker is Alvita Akiboh, an assistant professor of history at Yale University, specializing in the history of the United States colonial empire. Her first book, Imperial Material, National Symbols in the U.S. Colonial Empire, will be out with the University of Chicago Press in November of 2023, so just 2 months from now. It's already in my, I won't say the name of the company, my cart at an unnamed large corporate entity that sells books and other things. Imperial Material examines how seemingly mundane objects laden with U.S. symbolism, flags, money, and postage stamps became an arena in which contest over national identity played out in the U.S. colonies from the turn of the 20th century to the post-World War II era of global decolonization. Akiboh is currently writing about U.S. imperial administration, fraud, and scandal. And finally, Alice Christophe, who is a curator of the Oceania section of the British Museum in London, where she leads the Benioff Oceania program. She formerly helped care for collections in the ethnology department at the Bishop Museum in Honolulu, co-curating several exhibitions and supporting community-centric collection projects and initiatives. She was part of the CLOR Emerging Leaders cohort in 2023 and holds a PhD in art history and museology with a focus on the Pacific region. Her current interests, research interests include Pacific museologies, collection trajectories, past, present, and future, and stewardship methodologies. And in the kind of, as others have mentioned during our symposium, a number of the images are jarring, depicting kind of racist and sexist images. And we think it's important to reckon with these images. And I think it's particularly important in this kind of current historical moment where we've seen sort of political actors try to sort of downplay or sanitize the sort of role of racism and sexism in our nation's history. So I think it is really important to kind of grapple with and reckon with these kinds of images despite them being sort of troubling and offensive. So I'm gonna let Taína take the stage here. Thank you.
So this paper is an abbreviated version of my essay in the catalog 1898, U.S. Imperial Visions and Revisions. And due to time restraints, I'm only focusing on two of the contemporary artists whose work I addressed there. They are Gisela McDaniel and Miguel Luciano. As a curator working in a museum of national history and portraiture, I am interested in how McDaniel and Luciano's artworks operate as portraits that override their subject's coloniality, and how the position of these artists as diasporic people living in the continental United States is crucial to their dismantling of visual hierarchies that render the Chamorro and Puerto Rican king as others in the Euro-American imaginary. The year 1898 was pivotal in defining Puerto Rico and Guam's relationship to the United States. After the insular case Downs versus Bidwell in 1901, the Supreme Court's designation of Puerto Rico and subsequently of Guam as unincorporated territories where the provisions of the U.S. Constitution applied only selectively, established a condition of subalternity among the islands the United States ruled. Subalternity entailed not only a position of social disempowerment, but also one of subjection and silence in the U.S. national narrative. For decades and through a variety of strategies, art has been a primary arena of contestation of colonialism in what Lanny Thompson has called the Imperial Archipelago of the United States. Background on the migrations that came about in the wake of 1898 is key to understanding the work of McDaniel and Luciano. Even if the artists' individual stories might depart from the overarching narrative of migration of their ethnic and cultural communities, they exist in relation to them in that transnational diasporic space of fluidity where the homeland and the hostland are sometimes interchangeable. The year 1898 generated new circuits of migration from the United States to the island territories it claimed, between the territories themselves, and from the territories to the continental United States. What happened there? Okay, sorry. Chamorros started arriving in the continental United States in the early 1900s as whalers. Their migration here increased as they were introduced into military service in the 1930s. Later in the century, the drafts for the wars in Korea and Vietnam led many to relocate to the continent to join all branches of the military. Many of them established themselves in the vicinity of bases in California. In 1960, Typhoon Karen caused another wave of migration, with more families moving to California and becoming farm workers. Subsequent waves of Chamorros in search of better health services, education, and professional opportunities have relocated to Hawaii, Washington State, Florida, and Texas, among other places. In Puerto Rico, the U.S. occupation accelerated a foreign-controlled capitalist agrarian system where the sugar plantation economy, protected by the United States, drowned out the smaller sectors of coffee, tobacco, and food staples. Quickly, immigration presented itself as an escape valve for populations that were viewed by the U.S. government as excess and therefore fodder for relocation as a cheap source of labor. The earliest movements of Puerto Rican workers were directed to other islands, particularly Hawaii, In the 1920s, Puerto Ricans also started settling in the continental United States, and I'm only talking about 20th century here. Of course, there was an earlier presence in the 19th century, but that had a different relationship. So in the 20s, Puerto Ricans started settling in the continental U.S., on the East Coast and in the Midwest, but most substantially in New York City, with immigration climaxing between the mid-1940s and 1970s. As Puerto Rico transitioned from an agrarian to an industrial economy, Puerto Ricans took on jobs in the service sector and seasonal work. Since the island entered an economic recession in 2006 and declared bankruptcy in 2015, a new influx of Puerto Ricans has moved to the continental United States, a trend exacerbated by Hurricane Maria. Currently, there are more Puerto Ricans and chamorros living in the continental United States than on their islands. In 2019, the population of stateside Puerto Ricans amounted to 5.8 million, while the island's population in 2020 amounted to 3.2 million. And Silvia Alvarez-Crubelo mentioned this yesterday. According to the most recent census figures, 160,773 Guamanians and chamorros live in the continental United States, while the island has a population of 153,836 people. Although historically related, these diasporas are rarely discussed together or acknowledged in U.S. history as an outcome of the country's 1898 Imperial thrust. Colonial diasporic populations, like the ones to which McDaniel and Luciano belong, often live in a kind of limbo, not fully accounted for in the country where they reside or the one from where they hail. For McDaniel and Luciano, this outsider status vis-a-vis the United States creates an in-betweenness, productive space, a space that Homi Bhabha has called the beyond, which is a space of intervention to elaborate new forms of individual and communal selfhood and empowered forms of representation. Of course, these artists not only have to contend with the omission of their communities from the national U.S. historical narrative, but also with a history of representation of U.S. colonial subalterns that has been amply discussed here. And so although these images do not circulate like they used to at the turn of the century, the problem of visualizing the people of the colonies and understanding how they relate to the United States is a problem that persists, as Humberto Campo said yesterday in relation to the Filipinos too, for example. And at the National Portrait Gallery, it was a problem that was visible actually before Kate and I undertook this exhibition. And it was apparent that the narratives of 1898 in the museum were aligned with that narrative of triumph, and the populations from those lands seized by the United States were very much absent from the museum, very little present. Gisela McDaniel works against the established representational mode of primitivist painting featuring Pacific Islanders. The originator of this genre is French artist Paul Gauguin, who, starting in 1891 with his first prolonged stays in French Polynesia, created a body of work that projected onto the islands a Western fantasy of an uncorrupted Eden inhabited by people who upheld the attributes of the noble savage archetype developed by the Enlightenment philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Within the context of European colonialism at the turn of the 20th century, the incorporation of Oceanian and African motifs into Gauguin's art and that of subsequent so-called primitivist artists such as Picasso was an anti-colonial gesture. However, it was one that was steeped in colonialism and exotizing fantasies of the others. Paintings such as Three Tahitians present a romanticized vision of island life where locals exist half-dressed in a timeless space, almost like allegories. More controversially, Gauguin's paintings from Polynesia eroticized Tahitian girls and young women, veiling the artist's fixation through an interest in local spiritual traditions, as in Manao Tupapau, and sexual mores that differed from those in Europe. Gauguin's work epitomizes many Euro-American colonialist views, and its impact in art history has been monumental, securing its place in the canon and shaping a sexualized and racialized image of Oceanian indigenous women. Furthermore, these interpretations have contributed to a flattened view of the region as a tourist paradise. McDaniel disrupts this mode of representation. In Paloa Mihinilat, her subject gazes at us in a reclining but not submissive pose. She's partially nude with most of her body covered with straw and blue flowers. She's in a space that is both open and enclosed, and the snake plant in the foreground with its vigorous verticality echoes the strength in the subject's eyes. Behind it, the seal of Guam points to the cedar's heritage. The overall composition exceeds the canvas as some of the natural elements become three-dimensional, outgrowing the painting and bursting into the viewer's space.
I was going all the way back to the beginning of that moment when Magellan, or that, you know, in some ways that finds itself, more importantly, connected to genocide, like not just institutional violence, but a kind of genocide. It was a way of killing us. We have some of the highest rates of cancer in the world.
Super high class system, lavish vacation, and if it's not.
Okay, what you heard there is the sound component to this artwork. This painting is part of a new body of work that Gisela McDaniel has been working on for several years, where she integrates the sound of her interviews with her sitters in a sort of a cacophony that is only sometimes intelligible, but that recounts the trauma of colonization from the time that Magallanes set foot on the island of Guam through Spanish colonization, U.S. occupation, and also Japanese occupation in during World War II. The experience of Gisela McDaniel as a diasporic artist is very important in her making of these artworks. She talks about how she herself, as a chamorro growing up in Ohio, felt pain that nobody knew where Guam was, and that still today, on the very rare occasions where you hear about the island, it is in relation to nuclear threats. So she wants to assist the motion of the voices of the Chamorro people through her art, and also through her naming, titling them in Chamorro. She wants to prioritize her people and their disappearing language. Somehow I had timed myself, and this was I was doing well, but I'm not right now, so I'm cutting through. Thank you for your patience. Miguel's work, Miguel Luciano's work revolves around the themes of history, social justice, and popular culture. Born in Puerto Rico in 1972 and raised between the island and the United States, Luciano came of age at a time of heightened awareness around the topic of colonialism. The year 1998 was a major turning point in my artistic life, a major time of growth, he said. On July 25th of that year, he attended the large-scale demonstration at the site of the U.S. invasion that had occurred 100 years earlier in the Puerto Rican town of Guánica, where the experience of meeting and listening to nationalist leader Lolita Lebrón, who had led the attack to Congress in 1954, had a great impact on him. Less than a year later, in April of 1999, U.S. Navy ground control officer David Sanes was accidentally killed during a bombing practice in the Puerto Rican municipality of Vieques, the island of Vieques. And the tragedy brought into sharp relief the militarization of the island, and as a result of its territorial status, it set up a whole movement that had been going on for 60 years, but it refueled it. And as a result of it, the United States pulled the U.S. Navy from the island of Vieques in 2003 in one of the most significant landmarks of Puerto Rican history. This work is, the Cuño, is from a series that Miguel did at that time, around year 2000, and it illustrates his practice of taking commercial imagery. You can see the original image on the left, that references the place of Puerto Ricans in the U.S. economy and subverting it, imagery that is racist, and subverting it to include and make visible Puerto Rican struggles, in this case, the one in Vieques, as the militarization of Vieques and the struggle against it. Okay, So let me tell you about this artwork that we recently acquired. This very intriguing installation is titled Puerto Rican Cotton Picker and Freedom Rider Vest, homage to Felicita Mendez. And it centers the infamously named cotton picker bicycle, Schwinn mod, that Schwinn made in 1971. The 1970s witnessed the rise of Schwinn bike clubs as important circles of cultural affirmation and urban enjoyment among Puerto Rican diasporic communities, most notably in New York and Chicago. And this particular installation addresses the life experience of Felicita Mendez, who was born in Puerto Rico in 1916, moved to Arizona in 1926, so when she was 10 years old, when her family was part of a workforce of 1,500 Puerto Ricans recruited by Arizona cotton growers to make up for labor shortages in the U.S. Southwest. And when they arrived there, the conditions of work were not what they had been promised. They were given lower salaries, they were housed in terrible housing, they were charged relocation fees, and so they protested. 50% of them left, deserted their jobs, including Felicita's family. Later in life, living in Orange County, Felicita, California, Felicita married Gonzalo Mendez, who was a Mexican-born naturalized U.S. citizen. And in 1943, their children were not admitted to a local school on account of their skin color and also of their Hispanic names. They organized with the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC, and other community members, and sued 4 California districts for discrimination in 1944. Although Felicita's husband was the one named as the plaintiff in Mendez versus Westminster, she was instrumental in the lawsuit too, and in 1946 they won the case. This became a precedent for Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. This artwork pays homage to Felicita Mendez, speaks to her racialized experiences, appropriates that consumer object that makes that has a racialized name to refer to Puerto Rican cotton pickers, and turns it around through all these symbols of national Puerto Rican empowerment, the photographs of Felicita Mendez, and pins that place Felicita in a genealogy of racial and social struggles in the United States. So my point being that these two artists offer a counter-narrative through their artworks to Euro-American portraiture and art through their work, and that they subvert by that the art historical and the national historical narrative. Thank you.
And thank the organizers, Taína Caragol and Kate LeMay and Carolina Maestre is here, and Clara de Pablo for doing such an amazing job with this conference. Okay. So I just can go forward? Okay. All right. Show me which the one that goes to. Yeah. Oh, okay. Is it? It's up and down. I see. Here you go. Ah, okay. So just this one at the end. Yeah. Okay. All right. What floor is the painting on? Third floor. Okay. Thank you. All right. I'd like to thank Taína Caragol for having the foresight to acquire this painting, which you can see now on the third floor of the National Portrait Gallery. Taína was instrumental in acquiring this painting for the National Portrait Gallery from the Lorenzo Homar family. and remarkably gave me access to it in the height of a COVID pandemic. I also want to thank Teresa Tio for introducing me to the painting back in 2014, as well as Susan Homar, Pablo Delano, Jose Roberto Martinez, Christina Hawes, the late Ellen Hawes, Lucilla Marvell, Margarita Benitez, Jose Orlando Sued, and many others for sharing critical primary materials and insights. Cine Alba by Lorenzo Homar, one of Puerto Rico's most illustrious artists, is an intimate portrait and a complex representation of Homar's North American artist friends. It offers a window onto a remarkable cross-cultural exchange that served as a major force in the formation of Puerto Rican national identities in the 1950s. Cine Alba also serves as a counterpoint to the documentary photographs of Puerto Rico that I've been researching for a long-term book project, such as this photograph of Sinfora Velez Martinez, a rural worker from Sidra, made by U.S. photographer Louise Roskam in 1945 for the Puerto Rican government. Homar's painting cleverly flips the script, so to speak, by documenting the American documentarians from the critical perspective of a Puerto Rican artist who dedicated his life's work to an anti-colonial critique of U.S. imperialism. Let me start by bringing you into the painting. In 1952, Lorenzo Homar, the pioneering Puerto Rican painter, printmaker, poster designer, calligrapher, caricaturist, illustrator, and scenographer, rendered a compelling portrait of 5 North American artists whom he had befriended on the island in 1950 upon returning to Puerto Rico after living more than 21 years in New York City. These friends, with whom Homar closely collaborated on reform-minded projects for the Center for Puerto Rican Art, or CAP, and the now legendary Division of Community Education, or DIVEDCO, moved in the post-World War II years to this unincorporated territory of the United States, which has been called the world's oldest colony, where they built rich lives and created much of the best work of their multifaceted careers. The sitters here include, clockwise from lower left, writer and editor Ellen Hawes, cinematographer, film director, screenwriter, and musician Benjamin Benji Doniger, writer, musician, luthier, master carpenter, and calligrapher John Pete Hawes, graphic designer, book designer, illustrator, and educator Irene Delano, and at the center, photographer, filmmaker, composer, illustrator, and caricaturist Jack Delano. They are shown in a tight and shallow space set against a lush, dense tapestry of tropical foliage and the clear blue sky of Sidra, the mountainous region at the eastern center of the island, where the friends often gathered at the Hawes' home, a rural retreat from their San Juan city lives. A dachshund, identified as Pepe and belonging to the Hawes', balances the diminutive figure of Ellen Hawes, the only one out of scale with her contemporaries, and sitting on the fresh green grass. All the figures look intently at the viewer, and most appear with symbolic elements. Blooming daisies, a movie camera on a collapsed tripod, an untitled script or libretto, a film director's chair, and the small square card bearing the name of the new film company formed by these friends, Cine Alba, meaning Sunrise Films, which is also the title of the painting. In my extensive writing about Cine Alba, I've explored how the work expands our knowledge of Puerto Rican art of the 1950s, a so-called golden age of creative production that has been the source of great pride and strong critique. I examine the fruitful and fraught relations between Puerto Rican and North American artists at this moment of the construction of Puerto Rican national identity, a subject that has not been a strong focus of Puerto Rican scholarship. But given my limited time today, I can only begin to suggest Cine Alba's layered complexities by setting its historical stage, spotlighting a few of its protagonists, and suggesting some of its larger implications. First, to contextualize the painting. The post-World War II era saw the consolidation of power of the charismatic poet-turned-politician Luis Muñoz Marín, seen at left, the island's first democratically elected governor, founder of the Partido Popular Democrático, or Popular Democratic Party, PPD, and Puerto Rico's architect of modernity. Muñoz's mobilization of Jibaros, landless mountain men, and other rural workers as a powerful voting bloc, and his focus on pan, tierra, y libertad, sought to lift Puerto Ricans out of poverty. As Senate President, Muñoz, along with fellow populares, launched Operación Manos a la Obra, or Operation Bootstrap, transforming Puerto Rico from an agricultural to an export model industrial economy, using tax incentives to attract U.S. and other manufacturing investment. Puerto Rico began to be touted in the popular press as a modernized paradise, a, quote, showcase of democracy in the Caribbean, Cold War language that later set it in opposition to communist Cuba. 1952, the year of Cine Alba, marked the fateful year when Puerto Rico ratified its constitution and inaugurated its new, albeit ambiguous, status of Commonwealth, or Estado Libre Asociado, free associated state, which brought a measure of self-governance while keeping economic dependence on the U.S. Although the Commonwealth was supported by a large majority of participating eligible voters, it also saw resistance, especially from the nationalists, the small militant wing of independentistas who led armed assaults in 1950 and 1954 to call attention to the cause of Puerto Rican independence and denounce the Commonwealth as merely a new form of colonialism. And here you see Antonio Martorell's 1969 poster commemorating the fiery Nationalist Party leader, Pedro Albizu Campos, and the 1954 press photo of a defiant Lolita Lebrón being arrested for the shooting she and her male co-assailants carried out in the U.S. Congress. The 1950s also saw a related cultural transformation in Puerto Rico, a stunning creative flowering, especially in posters and the graphic arts, led by Homar, Rafael Tufino, seen at the right, Julio Rosado del Valle, Carlos Raquel Rivera, and Jose Antonio Torres Martino, who came to be known as the Generación del 50, or the 50s generation. Through independent collectives like CAP, artists used affordable prints to reach the masses, dignify rural and especially urban working class life, and extol distinctly Puerto Rican scenes and traditions as expressions of national identity, as, quote, weapons against colonialism. Many Puerto Rican artists, including Homar, represented at the left, took jobs with the government-sponsored Divedco, the New Deal-inspired grassroots education project created in 1949, which reflected both Latin American nation-building and U.S. Cold War democracy-building projects. Founded by Jack and Irene Delano and fellow North American artist Edwin Roskam, and headed by educator Fred Whale, Divedco produced and distributed interrelated posters, such as the one you see at the left, booklets, films, for poor rural communities, promoting public health, literacy, citizenship, culture, and, quote, democratic group action. The government hired these artists and writers, Catherine Marsh Kennerly has argued, to create a Puerto Ricanidad, a Puerto Ricanness, a cultural nationalism based on traditional rural values at a moment when those values seemed threatened by the rapid modernization. Despite the Puerto Rican artists' own pro-independence views and harsh critiques of the Popular Democratic Party, they believed in Divedco's experimental and populist program. Many of these artists distanced themselves from the Commonwealth status, and later Homar rejected any suggestion that his work was a tool of the PPD government. He did, however, call the work of the North Americans political propaganda for the PPD. But in 1952, Homar was deeply involved in Divedco And in fact, he was taking over the leadership of the graphics workshop from Irene Delano as the Delanos were leaving Divedco to start Cine Alba. As the main founders of Cine Alba, Jack and Irene Delano are the best known of the sitters. Jack Delano is famous in parts of Puerto Rico. While he is often referred to as an adopted son of the island, Irene Delano has recently been called by Nelson Rivera a citizen of the Puerto Rican nation. The Delanos have long been beloved for their humanity and humility, for the humanity and humility they brought to their documentation of the archipelago and its people. This is exemplified in Jack Delano's photographs and films, and in Irene Delano's posters and graphic designs. When the Delanos and Roscom founded Divedco, its first manifestation began in 1946. They never intended to stay on forever. By 1952, they believed the projects were in the hands of talented Puerto Rican artists and that they had fulfilled their commitment to their friends, Governor Munoz Marin and Inés Mendoza, to start the project. With the knowledge and insight they had gained, and with Jack Delano having learned all aspects of filmmaking, they felt ready to break out on their own. They invested much blood, sweat, and tears in this risky financial venture. Cine Alba was Jack Delano's baby and his dream. Thus, it is understandable that Homar would place Delano at the center of the picture, the leader with an intense and inquisitive stare. He is shown squeezed into a film director's chair, too hefty for its spindly legs. His uncharacteristically loud checkered shirt may be Homar's gentle jab, reminding us he is an outsider. With his bear-like hands, he holds a book on his lap which reads Libretto Por, indicating that the script for their first film was yet to be written. In fact, this became a prophetic metaphor for the troubles the team had writing a script, which led to the abandonment of the Cine Alba project. Ironically, according to film historian Naira Garcia Crespo, the success of the government-funded educational films of Divedco made it hard for commercial film to take root in Puerto Rico. More curious, even perplexing, is Homar's depiction of Irene Delano. She is shown as a sturdy figure with equally intense eyes, but hers are supersized. Although fashionably dressed, she wears practical shoes for working. And yet, she is the only artist not shown with a professional tool or holding a symbolic element. And it is Pete Hawes who holds up the logo of the company that she diligently designed through many elegant sketches, one of which you see at the right. We do, however, get a sense or a hint of her strict perfectionism, her strong symbiotic partnership with her husband, and her supporting role as assistant to the director of Cine Alba. Homar worked closely with the Delanos from the time Irene Delano hired him in 1951. They collaborated on Los Peloteros, the most acclaimed Divedco film about the determination of poor boys from Comerío who formed a baseball team against all odds. Homar, Irene Delano, and Luis Padial designed the poster. Jack Delano directed and scored the film based on a story by Amilcar Tirado. In a fascinating 1997 interview, Homar recalled the frictions around working on the poster, as if he had two bosses to answer to. Painful power struggles that brought him to the brink of quitting. He believed the Puerto Rican artists did not get the credit they deserved. The authorship of Los Peloteros, the poster, has long been a sensitive subject. And Homar felt the need to publicly correct the record, as he saw it, when critics assumed that Irene Delano initiated the famous Homar Tufino portfolio, Plenas. It's hard to responsibly assess these retrospective comments without corroborating evidence from the 1950s. But they do point to a need for closer examination of the working dynamics between the Puerto Rican and North American artists in these intensely collaborative years. It's also critical to assess such comments in light of the prevalent gender values at the time. As Teresa Tio has written, there were male Puerto Rican artists in those years who refused to work for a woman let alone an American woman. Whatever critique may be embedded in Cine Alba, evidence suggests that the group approved of Homar's painting. In small black and white reproductions, the image functioned as a kind of business card for the Cine Alba company to help promote the enterprise to film producers and distributors in the U.S. There are numerous aspects of Cine Alba that render it a tribute or commemoration. Homar pictured Pete Hawes in the guayabera, the white shirt that links him to Puerto Rican traditions. He depicted Ellen Hawes as an angel-like figure, recalling medieval and Renaissance Annunciation scenes, her daisies symbolizing the blossoming of the new film company. Even the most comic figure, Benji Doniger, in his, quote, gringo-esque flowered shirt, embraces his film camera close to his chest, which suggests his tireless devotion to his documentary work. A protagonist of another sort, the setting of the portrait, reinforces Cine Alba as an homage. The location is rural Sidra, the verdant mountainous region that was worlds apart from the capital city of San Juan. Pete Hawes built his family a house in 1949 in Sidra, where the Hawes' cultivated land, grew coffee, raised horses, and in their journalism praised the virtues of their Hebrew neighbors, some of whom became part of their family. The house, the interior of which you see here, with Pete Hawes entertaining guests with his handcrafted lute, became a gathering place where progressive artists and writers like Homar, Tufino, Tomas Blanco, and writers from Colombia, Cuba, and the States like James Baldwin debated politics, literature, and current events. Most relevant here, the house was the creative retreat for the Cine Alba team, the heart of their endeavor, and Sidra was the place where they searched for their film stories. Indeed, Ellen Hawes, Pete Hawes, their dog, create the triangular scaffold of the painting. Sidra itself held personal and symbolic symbolism for Muñoz Marín and the Popular Democratic Party. And here at the left, you see the governor and the first lady sitting with Jack Delano and Ellen Hawes. Sidra was where, in 1940, Muñoz and his allies strategized their first successful campaign. Muñoz had ancestral ties to Sidra, and his association with the Hebrews in this region and in neighboring Barranquitas, where he was born, was critical for his four-term gubernatorial success. In fact, the image here, thanks to Pablo Delano's research, is from a group of unpublished Life magazine photographs that likely resulted from Muñoz's request to borrow the Hawes' Sidra home for a photo shoot around the time of his third election. Finally, the tribute aspect of Cine Alba is brought to the fore when the picture is compared with Homar's more typical and often disdainful images of North American tourists at the time, such as Turistas at the left and the scathing Vitrina with independence leader Betances at the right. These show gaudily dressed, gawking or decadent tourists, continentals, who have rushed off a cruise ship to shop, cavort, indulge, and take snapshots of the, quote, natives in the tourist districts of Old San Juan and Condado, lacking self-awareness of their invasive and dominating presence. In great contrast, Cine Alba shows a group of North Americans as serious, purposeful, shown as a solemn ensemble evoking 15th century Italian holy conversation paintings, and rooted to the rural, a symbol of authentic Puerto Ricanness. These were, of course, Homar's friends, with whom he shared sensibilities, progressive political values, and defining migration or immigration stories. All spent formative years in New York during the Great Depression. As a New Yorker with bicultural identity, when Homar first returned to Puerto Rico in 1950, he experienced prejudice from fellow Puerto Ricans for being New Yorican, and ironically would have bonded with the North Americans from the metropolis as fellow outsiders. And in conclusion, with this in mind, I end by asking you to consider an Homar work of a few years later, the seal for the new Institute of Puerto Rican Culture, inaugurated by the PPD government in 1955. It shows 3 male figures, a Taíno Indian, an African man, and a Spanish conquistador, who are still widely seen as the triad of Puerto Rican cultural identity. An identity that notably excludes a North American figure, likely because of Homar's critique of U.S. imperialism and broader Puerto Rican resistance to the threats that U.S. culture posed at this heightened moment of cultural nationalism. This seal is problematic on so many levels, for promoting ethnic and racial hierarchies, and for celebrating a harmony that glosses over the violence of enslavement and decimation under Spanish colonial rule. But for this discussion, how might the seal give us deeper understanding of Cine Alba and of how Homar was grappling with the North American presence and its impact on Puerto Rican culture in the 1950s? To ponder this uncomfortable question, I leave you with Homar's own words, as they are as clever and layered as his pictures. In a 1983 autobiographical statement, he wrote, "Bernarda Shawn wrote in her wonderful book about her husband's work that art should be taken at face value. I do think it is true. When I look at a picture, I don't like someone telling me what it is all about. Unless it is technique, because then one always learns. But as she also writes, there will always be interesting questions." Thank you.
There we go. Hello, everyone. I'm Alvita Akiboh. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. I also want to thank Taína and Kate and Carolina for the wonderful exhibit and for inviting me to be here at this incredible symposium. I've been having this feeling the last couple of days, like my bookshelf has come to life, and it's just wonderful to be here. I also want to thank Clara de Pablo for organizing everything, and also our translators and sign language interpreters, all of the presenters for taking part in this discussion, and all of you, as Rick said, for making it to the end. So I'd like to start today with this object, the US $1 bill with George Washington's portrait. And the design is so familiar to most people that they are often surprised to learn that it was actually the design of this US Philippine 10 peso bill for over a quarter of a century before it became the design of the $1 bill that most of us know so well. Now, the similarities are uncanny, and even with the Philippine Islands and the reference to pesos, it would be easy to confuse the two. And that's precisely what troubled the US Treasury Secretary in 1928 when he requested the removal of George Washington's portrait from Philippine money. If it was a choice between Washington's portrait being on US or Philippine money, the Treasury Secretary thought it was a no-brainer. Washington's portrait, he argued, was, quote, a principal distinguishing feature of US currency. And indeed, this particular portrait of George Washington already graced the US $1 bill. But until 1928, US paper money was actually quite large, over 3 by 7 inches. When the Bureau of Engraving and Printing created this Philippine series in 1903, they decided they would cut costs by making the money smaller. So there was no concern that this 10 peso bill's design would be confused with the much larger $1 bill until 1928, when the Treasury Department decided to shrink the size of US money to match Philippine money and adopt basically this 10 peso design for the $1 bill. But when the Treasury Secretary's request to remove Washington's portrait from Philippine money made it to Henry Stimson, then U.S. Governor General of the Philippines, Stimson point-blank refused, insisting that the portrait stay. To eliminate Washington's portrait from Philippine money, he argued, quote, would be an unwise policy for American interests in the Philippines and could give rise to serious misunderstandings and misrepresentations. Governor General Stimson felt that Washington's portrait on money was doing important work in the Philippines. So important that he dared defy the request of a U.S. cabinet member to keep it. Now, debates about currency were hardly uncommon in the late 19th and early 20th century United States. This was the era of bimetallism campaigns at home and dollar diplomacy abroad. But this particular dispute stands out because it wasn't about gold or silver standards, exchange rates, or loans. The disagreement over whether George Washington's portrait should remain on Philippine money was purely about design. And that's what I want to focus on today. The designs on money and postage stamps, often containing the same portraits, as you can see here, that were used in U.S. overseas colonies in the years after 1898. Now, spreading U.S. money and postage stamps to the colonies had practical, non-symbolic benefits for the U.S. colonial state, like tying the colonies to the U.S. monetary system and to its official communication networks. But what I found in my research was that U.S. colonial officials were often just as concerned with the symbolic potential of these objects. And that's a story that I trace in my new book, which, as Rick mentioned, is coming out this November, Imperial Material, National Symbols in the U.S. Colonial Empire. The story of how objects laden with U.S. symbolism, like flags, money, and postage stamps, came to be part of everyday life in U.S. colonies, and the various ways that people living in the colonies have adopted, resisted, and even creatively repurposed these objects. Now, following these symbolic objects opens up an interesting set of questions, like why was it so important to U.S. imperialists that colonial subjects encountered U.S. national symbols in their everyday lives? How did these imperialists, soldiers, colonial officials, federal bureaucrats, teachers, patriotic organizations, businessmen, and more, how did they orchestrate the creation and distribution of these objects throughout a vast colonial empire that spanned the Caribbean and the Pacific? How did the boundaries of the U.S. nation shift and change as these symbolic objects became a part of everyday life in the colonies? And how have people in the colonies, excluded from the U.S. national polity, yet surrounded by U.S. national symbols, conceived of their own relationship to the United States? And what we see in the book is that these objects with national symbols that are often thought of as mundane actually became an arena in which contests over national identity played out in the U.S. colonial empire. And while flags are central to the book, as you can see on the cover here today, since we are at the National Portrait Gallery, I do want to focus my talk on money and stamps, and specifically the portraits on them. Now, around the world, government officials carefully choose designs for money and stamps that they feel best represent their country's national character and history. And the basic hope is that as these objects circulate domestically, they'll affirm national identity for those inside of the national community. And that as they circulate in foreign spaces, usually among collectors, that stamps and money might send a message to those foreigners about the national identity of that place. So what role did these objects play in the U.S. colonies, which, as we've heard, were officially neither foreign nor domestic? Well, U.S. imperialists hoped that a person in Puerto Rico or Guam sending or receiving a letter stamped with George Washington or Benjamin Franklin's portrait might feel that these men were their national heroes. Or that someone in American Samoa or the U.S. Virgin Islands purchasing goods with coins stamped with the American eagle and the legend United States of America might feel that despite their status, they too were connected to the United States. To use their language, these imperialists believed that these small symbolic objects could, quote, Americanize colonial subjects. They believed that in the long run, routine encounters with these nationally symbolic objects could invite those who were legally and politically excluded from the polity to nevertheless imagine themselves as part of a broader community of Americans, a community that many in the continental United States still prefer to imagine as national, but that partially through the efforts of these imperialists was becoming undeniably imperial. Now, these nationally symbolic objects arrived in most U.S. colonies in the crucible of war in 1898, when, as the Postmaster General put it, quote, "the mails followed the flag." Initially, the Post Office Department overprinted regular U.S. stamps to be used in occupied territories, and these overprints stemmed from a practical necessity and were intended to be a temporary measure. But nevertheless, they indicated a clear change in sovereignty. After decades of using stamps with Spanish monarchs, these overprinted U.S. stamps introduced people in former Spanish colonies to a pantheon of portraits of U.S. national heroes, including George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, James Madison, Andrew Jackson, and more. Now, these stamps mark the beginning of U.S. sovereignty in these places, but we can also see the printing of the names of these occupied territories over the portraits of U.S. national heroes as a visual manifestation of how colonialism wasn't just going to be a one-way imposition. These stamps suggest that the acquisition of colonies would also leave their imprint on U.S. national culture. Money, too, initially reflected an unsettled state of affairs in new U.S. territories. So coins with Hawaiian monarchs still circulated in the Hawaiian Islands for 10 years after the overthrow in 1893. And in former Spanish colonies, a mix of U.S., Spanish, and Mexican money circulated freely, causing much consternation for continental U.S. Americans in these places, who often complained and demanded that the dollar, quote, with the eagle on it, should be the sole and supreme legal tender anywhere the United States claimed sovereignty. Now, the introduction of U.S. money in the colonies was a really labor-intensive endeavor for the U.S. government. And for people living in the colonies, it was directly linked to disruption and loss, sometimes financial in the case of the 1900 exchange in Puerto Rico that caused hyperinflation, and sometimes symbolic, like Native Hawaiians mourning the loss of these coins, which one Native Hawaiian politician argued had been one of the last objects Hawaiians had to, quote, show that we were once a people. Once the various U.S. colonial governments had redeemed all existing coinage, they replaced it with U.S. dollars and cents throughout the colonial empire. And under extreme heat, the U.S. Mint melted down coins with the portraits of previous sovereigns of the Hawaiian Islands, of Spain, and later in the U.S. Virgin Islands of Denmark, and often even using that same metal, recast them into new coins expressing U.S. sovereignty. Now, in the Philippines, things were a little more complicated, and that's where I want to focus the rest of my time. For monetary reasons that I won't get into here, in 1903, economic experts decided to create a separate currency for the Philippines rather than putting them on the U.S. dollar, a new currency they decided to call the U.S. Philippine peso. So while people in other U.S. colonies have used the same U.S. coins and paper money and postage stamps as people in the continental United States, the U.S. colonial government in the Philippines and the Bureau of Engraving and Printing could create unique designs for the Philippines on both their paper money and their postage stamps. And as we know from the Washington bill that we saw at the beginning, they opted for portraits. Now, the Bureau of Insular Affairs, the government agency tasked with the governance of the Philippines, initially opposed using portraits because they worried that it would lead to debate about who deserved to be honored. But they soon agreed that Filipino patriot Jose Rizal should be placed on the 2 centavo stamp and the 2 peso bill. And you might be noticing that almost all of these portraits are upstairs in the exhibits. Now, Rizal was an anti-colonial activist, but because the Spanish had executed him before the beginning of U.S. rule, U.S. colonial officials determined that Rizal could be made into the perfect Philippine national hero, one that they believed would allow them to emphasize the United States' role in helping throw off Spanish imperial rule, while drawing attention away from the United States' own subsequent brutal subjugation of the Philippine independence movement. However, the director of posts in the Philippine colonial government warned that, quote, if we put Rizal on one stamp and don't put any Americans on the others, we may look for criticism from our American contingent on the islands. So the 4 centavo stamp and 5 peso silver certificate would honor William McKinley, the president who denied Filipinos their independence, And the 10 centavo stamp and 50 peso note would venerate an even more uncomfortable figure, Major General Henry Lawton, the highest-ranked U.S. officer killed in the Philippine-American War. They selected a few others, including Benjamin Franklin, Abraham Lincoln, and, of course, George Washington. Now, as early as 1905, the Bureau of Insular Affairs chief warned that using the same portraits on U.S. and U.S. Philippine stamps and money might cause confusion. And as we know, this came to a head in 1928 when the Treasury Secretary insisted that Washington's portrait be removed from Philippine money, and Henry Stimson, the U.S. Governor General of the Philippines, refused. Now, George Washington was an important symbolic figure in the U.S. colonial Philippines by 1928. By that time, it had been 30 years that children had been learning about him in schools, and the colonial government had made his birthday a national holiday with official celebrations each year, and Washington as a figure was also central to other holidays like the 4th of July celebrations. And in the archives, you can see that U.S. imperialists were very explicit about wanting Filipinos to consider Washington as a national hero, and that placing his portrait on money and stamps was an attempt to circulate this idea throughout the islands, even for people who would never attend their colonial schools. Now, of course, this was an awkward endeavor because many saw George Washington as a symbol of anti-colonialism, even calling Emilio Aguinaldo, president of the independent Philippine Republic that fought against U.S. colonial rule, the, quote, Washington of the Orient. So for many in the Philippines, seeing George Washington's portrait did not produce the intended feeling of gratitude for U.S. rule, but instead symbolized the hypocrisy of the United States, a nation born of anti-colonialism that was now colonizing a country that wanted its independence. But the U.S. Governor General held firm in his belief that Washington's portrait was doing important work in the Philippines. So they eventually reached a compromise, moving Washington's portrait to the left of the 10 peso bill and swapping it for a different portrait that I also believe is here at the National Portrait Gallery as well. Now, as the above episode indicates, the design of these objects did not remain static, and we can actually use these objects to chart how the government's thinking about how it wanted to represent U.S. colonial rule in the Philippines changed over time. So to conclude, I'd like to show you just a few examples from later in the book. In the 1930s, for example, when the Philippines became a U.S. Commonwealth with more autonomy and its promised independence, a new stamp series reflected this shift. So portraits of prominent U.S. Americans like McKinley, General Lawton, Franklin, and Abraham Lincoln were all replaced by official ideas of Philippine iconography, like this woman with a water buffalo and Fort Santiago in Manila. Only Jose Rizal and George Washington remained from the original series, though with different portraits, but again showing just how important these portraits were to colonial officials. In the 1940s, Philippine stamps changed once again, this time drastically when Japan invaded and occupied the Philippines, overprinting U.S. Philippine stamps to black out any mention of U.S. sovereignty and even to commemorate U.S. losses like Bataan and Caragol. Philippine stamps changed again in 1944 to reflect the return of the United States and, quote, victory over Japan, and then again in 1946 to commemorate Philippine independence from the United States. Indeed, tracing postage stamp design from the initial overprints in 1898 to independence stamps in 1946, we can see how the official narrative that the government wanted to present to Filipinos, to U.S. Americans, and to collectors around the world shifted during the period of U.S. colonial rule in the Philippines, all by analyzing the portraits, artwork, and imagery on these pocket-sized objects. Thank you.
3 devices that should do. Timer right here. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, perhaps I should start by thanking you all for making it to the last presentation of this whole symposium. I feel like I won the lottery here. Yeah, I really appreciate you staying until the end. Thank you. Like my colleagues, I also would like to extend my warmest thanks to the organizers of this fascinating 2-day event. I've learned so much in the last 2 days, and I'm really grateful to our host for your invitation and to our speakers for their amazing contributions. Thank you so much. My presentation today is going to take us a little bit outside of the frame from which we've unraveled Imperial legacy so far. And we're going to jump over the Atlantic to interrogate and hopefully revision the legacies of another competing empire, the British Empire. And we're going to do so by focusing on the incredible work, of Native Hawaiian artists, cultural practitioners, and scholars who, over the last years, have worked tirelessly to connect with and reconnect with Hawaiian mea kupuna, ancestral treasures, under the physical care of the British Museum, one epicenter of the British Empire, and historically one of its active arms. For the purpose of today's presentation, we're going to center on contemporary indigenous works and on the material culture that was and continue to be born from a process of nurturing and holding space between Hawaii and London. And as we look at these works together, I'll be sharing reflections on the museological practices developed to enable and empower this work, this change, in support of indigenous resilience and, I hope, resistance. But before I get too deep into this presentation, I want to start by acknowledging the indigenous people of this land, of this place, and amongst them the ancestors and descendants of the Anacostans, Piscataway, and Pamunkey peoples. I also want to honor the indigenous people who made a home here in the District of Columbia, and the indigenous organizations and leaders who have come to this powerful city to advocate for their rights and for their nation, including Queen Liliuokalani, who first visited DC as a princess in 1887 while en route to London for the Golden Jubilee of Queen Victoria. So in early 2020, I moved from Hawaii to London in the middle of British winter, in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, and 1 week before national lockdown. I know what you're thinking. Everything is wrong with this sentence. And as I made my way to the British Museum to pick up my badge, and that was before I was sent home for several months the very next day, as I made my way to the museum, I remember being struck by the architecture of this imposing building. And many of the architectural elements designed by Robert Smirke from 1823 onwards, and the building is completed in 1852, act as reminders of the historical ties between the museum and the empire. And further, these two photographs here were taken on September 14th, 2022, and that is 6 days after the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. Queen Elizabeth II was the great-great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, who hosted Queen Kapiolani and Princess Liliuokalani in London in 1887. And these photographs here, they also bear witness to the historical relationship between this institution, the British Museum, and the monarchy. And the image on the left shows the Union Jack, the flag, halfway down the mast as a sign of mourning. And the image on the right shows a portrait of the Queen, that is Queen Elizabeth II, and a book of condolence installed in the great court of the museum following her death. For me, these images are important not only because they demonstrate the forever presence of so-called history, and to a degree also historical violence in museum spaces, but they're also important because on this day, and that is September 14th, 2022, a hui, a group of 7 Native Hawaiian scholars, artists, and cultural practitioners were flying from Hawaii to London to research Hawaiian collections at the museum and to help reshape their care and their stewardship. So they arrived in London just a couple of days after the funerals, a couple of days before the funerals of the Queen, and I think some of them watched the funerals from their hotel rooms as well. As curators in this institution, there's not much we can do about the architecture of the building, but we can turn to a different kind of architecture, and that is the architecture of relationships. And we can turn to the transformation of museum curatorial practices to continue to affect change. And I love this image because it shows the hui, the group I just mentioned, having arrived in London and having passed the imposing gates of the museum to reach the collection storage facilities. And the group here is gathered to start examining and researching one of several ahu'ula in the collections, or feathered cloaks. And here, the feathered cloak that you see on this image is on permanent loan to the British Museum from the Royal Collection Trust, so again, this connection to the British monarchy. And it was sent to England in 1810 by the Hawaiian King Kamehameha I to the British King George III via the ship Duke of Portland. And it was accompanied with a letter addressed to George III requesting British protection should it be required by the Hawaiian nation. So at this point, I'd like to stress that this type of work that you just in the previous image, the discreet and intimate and deep work that happens behind the scenes and that rarely makes the headlines, this work, it's not new, right? Over the last decades, there's been many important moments, such as the moment you just saw on this image, when Indigenous colleagues from across the Pacific have been hosted and invited to connect with treasures of the ancestors. So, over the last 3 years, though, through the Benioff Oceania program, and thanks to the support of Lynn and Mark Benioff, we've been able to focus specifically and comprehensively on collections from Hawaii and Rapa Nui for the first time, and on the relationships with these communities. And empowered and inspired by the energy of our colleagues and collaborators in these archipelagos, the Benioff Oceania program has focused on transforming the stewardship, the research, the curation of collections from Hawaii and Rapa Nui at the museum. And this has meant progressively rethinking and reshaping museological practices across the board, from collection access to storage mechanisms, to changing the ways in which we collectively research and document these collections, changing who we're doing this for and how. And this work has affected how we think about care, physical care, but also spiritual care, and has inspired new avenues for conservation, display, and I hope the mobility for these treasures in the future. So it is with the members of this hui, of this group that's depicted here with the Hawaiian flag, that I'd like to take a moment to share their names, to say their names. Keali Rochelle, Ha'alilio Solomon, Kumola'au Singh, Haonani Balino Singh, Kale Nuhu'iwa, Umikai, and Lea Caldera, and many others that are not depicted here. It is with these people and with their support and people who've joined hands in this program that we've embarked on this journey of learning, of unlearning, and of relearning. Though it was not the goal of the program, this work and the space we've created and we've held between Hawaii and London has led to the creation of new works. And this is what I want to share with you now, and I'm gonna stop reading here. The works I'm going to show you in the last 5 minutes that I have are pieces that were made by 3 different artists. So you have a lapaiki, or drum, made by Kanae Kiave on the left. In the middle, you have a mahiole, or helmet, made by Kumula'au Singh, supported by Haunani Balino Singh. And then on the right, you have meakawa, or 2 weapons made by Umikai. And I'm going to start with this lapaiki that was made by Kanae Kiave in 2020. It's a lapaiki that is made of milo and shark skin, different types of fibers. And this is a drum that Kanae has recarved from his home in Hilo, again in 2020 during the pandemic. And that is inspired by one of the earliest drums in the collection of the British Museum. This drum here, unfortunately, and this is also what we've done, we've held space for the unknown name of the artist, or the artist is unknown to this day. And the provenance of this drum is also unclear. We know that it came to England from Captain Cook, but we don't know from which island it was collected and who was on the other side of this transaction, if it was a transaction. So this particular drum inspired Kanae to recarve his lapaiki, and this is a drum that he'd never seen as he engaged in the carving of the piece. And so the process that you see here is a process that happened in a mirror, with us in London on the one side, really transforming the ways in which we looked at and we researched this particular drum, taking new photography for Kanae, for the artists, for the purpose of supporting his practice, and Kanae on his side in Hilo, recarving and reshaping his piece. This is a process that took place over several months, and that led to eventually Kanae, after the travel restrictions were lifted, traveling to London for the first time ever, and connecting with this particular pahu, or drum, including with the lapaiki that he had recarved. And Kanae honored us in this visit by presenting his lapaiki to us, together with a prayer composed by Larry Kimura, and I would be happy to pass it on after this presentation. I will skip to the next slide. The second piece I wanted to share with you, that we'll see in the next slide, is a piece that was created by a couple of master weavers who specialize in ulana ie. Ie is the aerial root of a plant that grows in a plant forest. And these weavers spent a lot of time with us in collections looking at mea ie, or pieces made with ie, including these incredible mahiole, or helmets. And the piece on the right here is the piece that Kumula'au and Haunani have decided to recreate and engage with. And this is the piece, again, on the right, that they are making at the moment. So this is a very recent photo. I forgot to mention that all these photos are used with the permission of the artists, and they know that I'm presenting this today, and they send their aloha. So the work that we did with the Singhs has led us to upland forests, and their work is really, again, stripping down the process in a way that maybe echoes also the ways in which we've stripped down our processes. They're going back into the forest, removing invasive vines, and allowing ie to grow and thrive in the forest. And I'll finish 1 minute with Umikai, who is a lua practitioner, a master carver, who also came to London to engage with the collection, work and study. And when I say engage, it really diminishes the quality of the work that these people have done in collection, meaning researching and looking at material culture as well as archives. Umi made 2 incredible pieces that he presented to the museum as well. And those pieces are used as weapons to protect other treasures that are in collections. So they are part of the spiritual care of the collections that exist in London. So I'll just conclude with this photo to be right on time. This photo, these are the two meakawa, sorry. This photo is a photo that was taken during the visit of the Hui that I just mentioned. And it showcases all of us, so Native Hawaiian cultural practitioners, artists, scholars, together with conservators, curators, head of departments, everybody at work and put to work by Umi Kai. And Umi put us through this exercise by which we were asked to recarve a niho'oki, or a little knife. And this is the work that together we each created a niho'oki, which is both a weapon but also a utilitarian knife, something that gives you strength but something that can be used every day as well. And Umi, as he was contemplating this photo, and I'll finish with a quote by him, a caption for this photo that he wrote, saying, all slightly different, all beautiful, all with the same function, carving a better and new understanding of our past to create a better future.
All right, so we're running a little over time, and I want to praise our timekeepers for doing the difficult work. I've been on your position before, losing the battle with the speakers, so I do empathize. But I mean, working with academics, people often say it's like herding cats. You ever try to get a cat to do something difficult? Anyway, because we're running over a little over time, I wanted to just sort of open it up to the audience to kind of get their chance to interact with the speakers. I'm already interacting with them, so I've got special access to them, so I don't need to take up time. So if anyone wants to go to either one of the microphones on the side to jump into this discussion, our final discussion of the symposium, now is your opportunity. All right, we already have somebody. Jem.
Thanks. I'm interested to know who was the artist for the Rizal figure on the stamps and money?
Thank you so much. I actually don't, it's in the exhibit, isn't it? Juan Luna, okay, yeah.
Oh, it is.
So the interesting thing, I'll just, to say a little bit more, often for the stamps, not so much for the money usually, but oftentimes these various governments would hold competitions where they would ask citizens or non-citizens, whatever the case may be, to submit different kinds of designs. And I should also say, as I briefly mentioned, they were very wedded to having portraits at first, and they were often very proud to say, like, these were by Filipino artists or Puerto Rican artists. And then as they moved on from portraits, they would hold these open competitions where people would submit all kinds of art, and then the government would have a committee of people that would get together and decide, you know, does this best represent what we want to convey? Is it going to promote tourism? I was actually just going to say this to Laura, that Irene Delano actually ends up designing a stamp for Puerto Rico after, it's after the 1947 act that allows Puerto Ricans to finally elect their own governor. And if you look up 1947 Puerto Rico, so I'm sure you can find it, but it's the archetypal Jibaro holding a ballot box in one hand, you know, kind of meant to, this is development, this is industry. But yeah, she, in the archives, I found her saying, like, why did they ask me to design this stamp? I've never even looked at a stamp before. Is this even important? And then she sort of comes to realize that these designs are actually quite important. Yeah, that's a long answer, but thank you.
Oh, thanks. That's exactly what I was looking for in terms of the background. Thanks.
other questions? We have 4 minutes. I want to keep us on time. I'm going to really be assertive here.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for a phenomenal closing session to a great symposium. My question, I guess, might be for all of you, but it comes from Alice Christophe. You raised this question of spiritual care as a possibility, and I'd love to hear a lot more from all of you of how scholars and artists, as well as curators, might engage in that kind of spiritual care. Thank you.
Do you want me to start? Yes, it's working. Thank you for asking this question. You know, I think it's been such a journey for all of us at the British Museum and beyond to engage with that notion. And I think for us, it has meant making space for practices that we weren't always expecting or that are not part of, you know, policies and procedures and institutions. It has meant making space for people's personal connection to these treasures. It has meant making space for intimacy in relation to these treasures as well. So in some cases, letting people be with these treasures in a room without us being there. In some cases, allowing for protocol when appropriate, not forcing that either. And in some cases, it's meant allowing for things to come into collections that shouldn't be in collections. For instance, pieces like, I'm thinking about a bowl filled with water, for instance, or plants that people bring with them. I mean, this is just a basic answer, but in general, I think it's meant flexing, shifting practices, and making space for the unknown to us, at least.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. Well, in terms of the portrait gallery, we have had the beautiful opportunity to honor in this exhibition, thanks to our collaboration with our friends now in Hawaii and with the Hawaii State Archives with Yolani Palas. And really, it's the credit here goes to my colleague Kate LeMay, who established a relationship with them in order to bring the portrait of Queen Liliuokalani. And a condition very much of that loan was to be able to make space for a blessing the day before the opening by 3 of the Royal Societies of Hawaii. And however, this was not the first time we had such a I guess a ceremony in our halls. A year ago, pretty much a year ago, we had a descendant of an Oglala, an Osage figure represented now in our collections, who came to bless the portrait of his great-grandfather too. So these are, there are new practices that are just starting to come into the museum. At the National Portrait Gallery, we have not had much of an opportunity to establish them yet, but we're certainly very open to them. We recognize it's really important. Portraits have a special, they embody people in many cases, and that's why iconoclasm is also a thing too, right? Which is the other side. And for sure we look forward to be able to be an open space for that.
Your question was about spirituality, right? Spiritual traditions. So the first thing that came to my mind with regard to what I was talking about is may not be exactly what you're talking about, but it's a kind of spirituality, and I think that has to do with the origins, the ethnic and religious origins of the artists that I was talking about. Lorenzo Homar comes from Spanish and Moorish, actually. He thinks far back on his father's side, so he has some Muslim heritage, but more recently it was Spanish and Catholic, and he was not religious, but clearly was very well attuned to religious traditions of Catholicism. I think you can see some of the Renaissance aspects of the painting. And what's so interesting, I think, is the 4 of the 5 sitters in his painting actually come from Jewish backgrounds. They were not Catholic. Pete Hawes, the one who built the house in Sidra, and the instrument maker, and the calligrapher, he came from a Protestant background, but absorbed some Catholic traditions in his upbringing. But my point here really is that when they moved to Puerto Rico, these Renaissance people really, they adapted to the Catholic traditions, not from a religious perspective at all, but from a cultural perspective. And I think that a lot of that really was out of respect, frankly, for the long Catholic traditions of the island. So I think that is really interesting, how these people from very, very different backgrounds were able to understand the significance of the Catholic traditions, again, from a not necessarily from a religious perspective, from a cultural perspective, and find ways to, again, be part of that cultural nationalism. So, in a kind of transnational way, if that makes sense.
Can we take one more, Kate? All right, yep, I see one more.
My question is for Lauren. In a way, you sort of got ahead of my question.
Okay.
And I really appreciated how you brought in the seal of the Instituto de Cultura Puertorriqueña. And so my question to you is, are you planning on exploring that? Because one of the fascinating contradictions of nationalism in Latin America in the 1930s is this embrace of Catholicism without enough critical perspective of all the negativity that involved. So.
Alejandro, nice to see you. Wow, that's a big question. I personally was not planning on going to explore the seal. However, many people have. I think a lot has been written about the seal. A lot of interesting gender studies also have been applied to the seal. Obviously, there's no female representation there as well. I think what's so problematic about the seal from Homar's perspective is that it's hard to know how much of it was his values versus the values of Ricardo Alegría, who was such an instrumental force in the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture. So it's hard to know how much he was fulfilling an assignment versus how much it was his own personal values. So I think that really has to be explored on one level to get to some of the other, issues. But one could still look at the seal even separate from him, right? Because it transcends him, and it obviously has a larger cultural value. And it has changed over the years. I think what's interesting is how the seal has changed. My sense is that my understanding is still used at the Instituto. Is that correct? I think it. Does anyone? I think it. Does anyone? Yes. Does anyone know if it's?
It is.
Yes, it is. Okay, thank you. So it obviously has a legacy. It has a legacy. It has a currency. So yes, I think someone really does need to examine that, the history of it. Like I said, I think there have been interesting studies. There have been race-related studies. There have been gender-related studies. But I would love to see a real thorough historical look at how it has evolved and its relationship to, I guess you could say that the hierarchy really of the Spanish conquistador at the center, right, which is the hierarchy of Catholicism as well. Yeah, I mean, I do think another thing that's quite interesting that I think any of you who work in these fields know is there has been a real push towards a more transnational approach towards, I know at least within Puerto Rican studies. And in fact, I quoted Naida Garcia Crespo, who's written a great book on Puerto Rican film, history of early Puerto Rican film, and she argues for a more transnational approach that needs to move away from a limited way of defining Puerto Rican identity.
that Puerto Rico
Laura,
made. Yeah.
but the
Yeah.
current seal is all letters, no iconography.
Oh, they must have removed it then. It's just letters? They've taken out the figures. Do you know when they took the figures out?
Recently.
It's pretty recent. Okay, so it's very recent. Yeah. So a transnational approach, right? Involving the sometimes uncomfortable idea of looking at foreigners' relationship to the island and how they actually contributed to a cultural nationalism, right? And when I say foreigners, I mean lots of outsiders, right? I mean Dominicans, I mean people from other parts of Latin America and the global south who settled in Puerto Rico, who absorbed the cultural traditions and added to the cultural nationalism, right? I think there's a big push towards examining the roles of all of these people in building a cultural nationalism, which might get to exploring the seal, right? That may.
Thank you.
Okay. Long and winding way.
All right, so thanks to the panelists, and a special shout out to Taína and Kate and Clara for orchestrating both the symposium and this really awe-inspiring exhibit upstairs. Thanks to everyone for sticking around and for sharing in this sort of rich, I don't know, series of sort of stimulating talks and images. I learned a lot. So thanks to everybody for being here, and have a good weekend.
I'm going to take this opportunity to make some thank you remarks, closing remarks. This is a full house, and big shout out to all of you. We have more than 70 people still here, so that's amazing, and it's frigid. I know it's very cold. We have no control over the heat, so we've been kind of like shrugging when you tell us it's so cold. Sorry about that, but thank you for just making it. I want to say that this full house really does reinforce our conviction, Taína and mine, and all the curatorial staff at the Portrait Gallery, that representation matters. And, this 1898 could have been an absolute disaster, and it wasn't, or so far it's not. Knock wood, right? But so far, people are really interested, engaged. I mean, this symposium really shows us that. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts. We do feel that our exhibition is a platform to just start a conversation. We, in talking to Hialoha Johnston early on, she is this incredible colleague and friend who coached me through, the politics of Hawaii and sort of navigating what that would be like. And she just said, Kate, this is a conversation, and you're starting this conversation, and that's so important, and that's what matters. So I want to give a shout out to Jessamine Battario, who is here from the Colby Art Museum, who has an exhibition in the works, the Islands Project, and it is going to be on view, do you know when yet? 2026. In 2026. And Jessamine is a curator of contemporary art, and this show is very much the contemporary kind of conversation of the 1898 reckoning with 1898. So I do want to plug anyone else, just let us know. We want to keep this conversation going. Thank you to our speakers. You all traveled enormous distances to get to us. There was a question of a last-minute visa from Cuba. I mean, there was a lot of drama in a good way. We were like, is he going to make it? Is Jose Manuel going to make it? And he made it, and CS is here. Thank God. So thanks to the Cuban powers and the U.S. diplomacy powers to be that orchestrated it, not going there. I want to plug in September on the 24th and October 1st, Taína has been working very hard on a set of film programs. One is directed by Francis Negron Mutaner, War on Guam. So that film will be screened here, and Taína will be in conversation with Francis. On October 1st, we're screening Foreign in a Domestic Sense, which is directed by Natalia Lassalle Morillo, and Sofia Galiza Muriente with a discussion between Taína and Judith Escalona, who's here, or was here. She's here. Yes. Hi, Judith. So we do have more programming around 1898 on the September 4th and October 1st. We're going to send out a survey, so please give us your feedback. Don't tell us it's too cold. We know that. There's nothing we can do about that. I'm so sorry. I'd like to thank the ASL interpreters, heroes. You're all so amazing. I watch you, and I marvel at how you can keep up with us, and you do, and we recognize you. Willie, back in the booth, AV, amazing. He makes me feel calm, which I really need in my life. I need someone always, like Willie. Thank you, Willie. The AV team is great. Security for keeping us safe. Thank you to security. Thank you to our volunteers. We have Olivia, and is it Jo? I'm going to murder your name, and I'm sorry. Jaharis. Clara De Pablo, big thank you to Clara. Where is she? Clara. And now we're, thank you again. We're going to close down this beautiful symposium. I would like to invite the speakers to come up for a group photo. So if you speakers are still here, please come up for a group photo. And I think that some of our speakers are at the Hotel Monaco, so if anyone's going out for drinks or whatever, that might be a good spot to go. Thank you.